Well, here we are, part 3. And let me briefly summarize where we've been so I can set the stage properly for part 3's discussion. So this series, if you're just joining us or if you have been around, you know that this series is organized around a single question. What does it mean for anything to be? We're approaching that question through Heidegger, but we're also using a method borrowed from Harold Bloom. Harold Bloom is the literary critic, and if you've never heard of him before, I would really recommend just go on YouTube and Harold Bloom Shakespeare lecture. Maybe you can find it. He does a series, I think it's on the Great Courses or something like that. I don't remember. Oh, you know what? I can just pause here. I'm going to check. All right. So it's not the modern scholar. It's not the Great Courses. It's actually the modern scholar. And it's called Shakespeare, the 7 Major Tragedies. And I really recommend this. I mean, it changed my life. It changed the way that I read literature, the way that I interact with the world. So if you're really interested or if you want to know more, please check out the introduction to this Heidegger series. I go full into explaining the methodology of Harold Bloom. And, for this series, we use Harold Bloom to express the idea that major thinkers advance by struggling with their predecessors, misreading them in productive ways, swerving into new territory. That's the pattern that we've been tracing. In the introduction, I laid out Heidegger's account of lived time, where I was showing you that it's not a line. We exist in 3 temporal dimensions simultaneously. We are always ahead of ourselves in future possibilities. We carry a past that remains active as our inherited situation. And we act in a present where those 2 dimensions meet. So we bring us with us, right? We bring us, our lived experience, our opinions, our tastes, we bring that into the present while we're always living in the future, of course, through our mind. We're always thinking about what we're going to be doing. Heidegger's term for this unified structure is care. It's Mitsein. And the mood that can break us out of habit, drift, is anxiety. Now, funny enough, I'm actually reading The Concept of Anxiety by Kierkegaard right now. It's all about the historical concept of anxiety. And so this is part 3, okay? This is part 3 of the series, the Heidegger series. And I'm going to pause here because I want to flesh out some terminology. So you can come back to this spot to refresh if you need. Let's first talk about anxiety in Heidegger's technical sense. This is not nervousness or worry or clinical dread. It is a fundamental mood that has no specific object. So fear is always fear of something, right? Like a snake or a deadline, a diagnosis. Anxiety, by contrast, is not about any particular thing in the world. What oppresses you in anxiety is your own existence as a whole. The sheer fact that you are and that you have to be, you're this being in the world, and you're breathing, and you're going to die. When anxiety, rises in a person, the everyday world of tasks, roles and chatter temporarily loses its grip. The meanings that normally guide you, like your job title, your social obligations, even your sense of yourself as a certain kind of person, They suddenly feel weightless. They don't disappear, but they cease to provide this grounding element. Heidegger describes this as a slipping away of beings as a whole. You are left alone with the bare awareness that you exist and that this existence is yours to carry forward into possibilities you may choose. This is why anxiety is the condition for authenticity. It pulls you out of the absorption, out of the anonymous, what he calls the they. That's the das Man. And it confronts you with the fact that your life is fundamentally your own without any ultimate external justification. It reveals that what is at stake in care, that's the past, present, and future all at once, is your own being. It is not anchored in anything solid, and that can be unsettling, but it is also a freeing in anxiety. You face the truth that you are the one who must answer for what your life becomes. And Heidegger calls this the individuating function of anxiety. It singles you out, not by making you special per se, but by removing all the borrowed identities that you normally rely on, leaving only the irreducible responsibility of existence. All right, let's talk about care as well, because care translates the German Sorg, but in English, it sounds like affection, worry, or looking after someone. So I want to tell you to set that aside. Heidegger is not describing an emotion. He is describing the formal architecture of a human life, the basic structural fact that unlike a rock or a chisel, your own existence matters to you in a way that demands something from you. He capitalizes it or calls it the care structure, precisely to mark this difference. So instead of caring about, think like being invested in or having your own being at stake. Remember the way Heidegger wants us to think about time. We are made up of the past. We take the past with us. We're alive right now in the present, and we are projecting ourselves constantly, always thinking about the future. This is the structure of Sorg, care. Care is not a feeling you have on top of these. It is the way that these three structural moments are always already tied together. You could be a ruthless cynic or a loving parent. Either way, you are care because your being is still an issue for you, structured by projecting, thrownness, and the practical immersion. And there's another term I want to talk about that we're probably going to catch here. And this is going to give you some gravity towards like the concepts that we're talking about. And yes, there is one about emotional, sensibility. So this one is Mitsein, and that's being with. So being with others. This belongs here, but it's without becoming love. Okay, so Mitsein is equally structural and equally non-emotional. It means that to exist at all is to exist with others. This is not an observation about liking people. It's a claim about the constitution of the world. Even the hermit who shuns society defines himself in relation to an absent social world. Even a misanthrope's contempt is a mode of being with. Others are not objects I first encounter and then decide to care about. They are always already disclosed as fellow presences in the world that that we all share together. So Mitsein is not an attachment we add to a pre-existing self. It's an original dimension of how a world opens up to us at all. An example, like a solitary astronaut drifting in space is still Mitsein, the astronaut's entire situation, the spacecraft that they depend on, the language in which they think, the missions that they choose or rejected, that was all shaped by others and remains, the astronaut still remains orientated toward them, even in their absence. So the astronaut's solitude is only meaningful against the background of a shared world. So Heidegger's point is that this sharedness, it's not optional. You cannot strip away and arrive at a pure private self. It is built into the way any world opens up for you at all. So when Heidegger uses Mitsein, he's not describing companionship or like affection or even social interaction. He's naming a fundamental existential structure. The fact that your being is always already disclosed in a common world with others who are likewise cut up in their own existence, just like you are. And without this dimension, you would not be a human being. You would be some sort of object. So that's what Mitsein is. And Heidegger draws a line between these. So there is an ontological care, which is called Sorg. And that's what we talked about, right? The deep structural condition that makes any ontic caring possible. It answers what is the basic makeup of a being who exists, whose existence matters to it. And then there is the ontic caring, which is, I think it's like Fürsorg, which means concrete acts of concern. This is where it gets emotional. The concrete acts of concern for others, like love, benevolence, helping, but even indifference or neglect. These are specific ways we interact, that we enact our being within the world. Love, then, is one ontic mode of caring among any. Okay, so care itself is neutral, primordial, and unavoidable while you exist. You cannot love unless you are the kind of being who is already caught up in the mattering of your own being, already thrown into the world that you share with others. And the underlying caught upness is care. Love is a particular expression of it. It's not its synonym. So the best explanation is care is the structural fact that your life is at stake for you. Mitsein is the structural fact that the world you inhabit is already a shared world, and neither is a feeling. And when we talk about love, love is a specific ontic way of taking up both facts. And I hope that clarifies, and deflates, the romantic indications. Part one, we looked at the modern background Heidegger had to work through. So Descartes established the picture that still shapes most assumptions today, a thinking subject separated from a world of objects. Heidegger's response was the idea, being in the world, we're not detached spectators. We're practically immersed. Like I said, in the lecture, I was talking about the arm, so I know I'm me, and the me I think I am, but my arm is a part of this experience too. So, that's like us through inside with the world. A tool only becomes an object. So a tool only becomes an object of explicit attention when it fails. Okay, so that the example was the hammer, where, we don't see the hammer as wood and metal. We see the hammer as a tool. We pick it up, we start doing something with the hammer, and the hammer basically becomes a part of us. It becomes a part of our being, our action, our intent. And it's not until the hammer really breaks that we notice, oh, look at the hammer in its pieces. Okay, so the Cartesian way of looking at the world is that the world is in pieces. And it's, deciphering everything as separate objects, and that's called Vorhandenheit. Vorhandenheit, that's the German word. And the German word for, the presence, which is Zuhandenheit, that's where we don't really think about the things that we're using and doing. Like when we're using a keyboard, we're typing. We don't really think about what the keyboard is made of and where it was created or where it was made and when we bought it. We're just using it as an extension of ourselves. So we talked about Husserl, which was Heidegger's teacher. Husserl gave Heidegger the phenomenological method, go to the things themselves. But Heidegger refused Husserl's notion of pure transcendental ego, insisting instead on a thinker always already situated in a particular historical and practical context. So again, please look at part 1 if you want to learn more on that. So part 1 is Descartes, Husserl, and Bergson. And Bergson, for his part, argued compellingly that lived duration is not clock time, but Heidegger critiqued him for still relying on spatial metaphors, and more importantly, he reversed Bergson's emphasis. We are not pushed forward by the accumulated past. We are pulled forward by the anticipation of our own death, the future's most decisive limit. And part 2, we went back to the Greeks to locate the origin of the problem. So Plato's cave allegory shows the original experience of truth, which is aletheia. Remember, I've always said aletheia. The pronunciation is aletheia, so you can decide which one you want to use. And that's an unconcealment, things emerging from hiddenness. But Plato's turn toward eternal forms began the shift from truth as disclosure to truth as mere correctness of judgment. And when we got to Aristotle, Aristotle had formalized the question of being with extraordinary nuance. So dunamis and energia, the potentiality and actuality. They capture the temporal unfolding of things. Yet even Aristotle ultimately privileged presence, the fully actual, the now, as the highest mode of reality. And that priority is given to what stands present and stable, set a pattern that obscured the more elusive, withdrawing dimension of being. And it shaped the metaphysical tradition for centuries. So again, if that sounds a little bit dense right now, or like, oh my God, what are you talking about? I strongly suggest that you go back and just check out those podcasts. One really cool thing you can do nowadays, if you go to your Google Chrome, you can add attachments, and you can add a notebook LM attachment. So, or like, I think Gemini even shows up too on YouTube if you have a YouTube subscription. Or you can basically copy the YouTube link, put it in Gemini or in Notebook LM and say, can you please tell me, can you please summarize for me? So you won't have to go through the exhaustive 50 minutes, but you should, because that's how I can, benefit from it. And also, sometimes summaries, they don't catch the nuances. And I mean, that's why I called the podcast Eros and Exegesis. It's the passion of, uncovering the layers of, getting inside of the text is, and the best way that we can, extract all of this information is by talking about it, thinking about it, imagining what things could mean. Okay, we are ready. We're turning to part 3 and the limits of reason and the dark ground. So the ancients established that reason seeks stable presence. The moderns isolated the thinking subject. The question that then becomes unavoidable is whether reason can account for its own foundations. or whether there's something in the very structure of thinking that resists complete transparency. Today, we're taking up three thinkers who each confronted that question directly: Kant, Schelling, and Hegel. I'll try to present their arguments as clearly and fairly as I can, letting their disagreements stand without forcing any easy resolutions. Now, remember, this is Heidegger's, destruction. This is his confrontation with these thinkers. These are not complete exegesis on these thinkers alone. So it's going to be very, contained through the scope of Heideggerian logic. All right, and first we're going to talk about is Kant. So this is going to be chapter 6 now of part 3. And the finitude of knowledge and the retreat from time. I actually wrote a massive essay on this already, because for me, this is probably the most critical thing that's ever happened in philosophy, is when Heidegger, his reading of Kant, I truly believed it changed the entire trajectory of philosophy. And that trajectory changed the world. I mean, it literally became the postmodernist movement. And I would be so excited to share that with you. But that'll have to happen in time. So let's just talk about this for a second. It is, first of all, it's when we're talking about Kant, we want to just, back up a little bit here, because it is impossible. It is absolutely impossible to imagine the world without Aristotle existing. And in precisely this way, there would be no Heidegger without Kant, right? Like, so much groundwork was laid by Aristotle himself. And now what I'm saying here, where I say like there would be no Heidegger without Kant, this is exactly the kind of, the fracture that I'm talking about. I mean, yes, Heidegger gained so much from, Aristotle. He gained so much from Descartes and developing all of this. But I mean, his reading of Kant is absolutely, again, it has to be one of the absolute foundations of how the world kind of went sideways. The relationship between these two thinkers may be written about as long as there are thinkers left to write, for the simple reason that before we can ask why there is something rather than nothing, before we can ask what being is in its deepest sense, we must pass through the critical threshold that Kant was the first to establish with systematic rigor. Kant did not merely contribute to philosophy, he completely changed it. He revolutionized it. It's very self-understanding. Kant's project becomes intelligible only when we see him responding to a specific crisis. And that crisis was the collapse of the old metaphysics under the philosopher David Hume's skepticism. Kant's question is not simply, how is knowledge possible, but how is metaphysics possible after Hume showed that causality has no rational ground in experience? Heidegger cares about this because Hume's challenge exposes the temporal character of synthesis. When the mind connects cause to effect, it is performing a temporal act, expecting the future to resemble the past. Kant's answer, that imposes the category of causality. This is his attempt to secure necessity without appealing to things in themselves. But the price is that necessity becomes a feature of our cognitive apparatus, not of reality. So finitude becomes structural. He claimed the Copernican turn, where Copernicus showed that the sun is in the center of the solar system, not the earth. Kant showed us that objects must conform to our cognition rather than the reverse. He gave us the transcendental deduction, the argumentative engine that asks how concepts can relate to objects a priori. He distinguished phenomenon from noumena, establishing the boundary between what can be known and what can only be thought. He formulated the categorical imperative, grounding morality in the universal form of reason itself. He wrote the three critiques, carving reason into its theoretical, practical, and aesthetic dimensions. And he named his own philosophy Transcendental Idealism, a position so subtle that 2 centuries of scholarship have not exhausted its meaning. He is not merely a figure in the history of philosophy, he is the titan upon whose shoulders the entire subsequent tradition stands. And the Critique of Pure Reason, that massive edifice of critical thought, could easily have been titled Being in Time, for it is, at its hidden center, an investigation into the temporal conditions under which anything at all can show up for a finite knower. Time for Kant is not just one topic among others. It is the form of inner sense, the fundamental structure through which all appearances are given. And if all appearances are given through time, then the question becomes, what is being? It cannot be separated from the question, what is time? That is exactly the insight that Heidegger would spend his entire career unfolding. So imagine a library. Imagine being in a library with no windows. The books within it are magnificent, encyclopedias, atlases, volumes of the classics, poetry, philosophy, accumulated wisdom over centuries. The librarian knows every shelf, every volume, every page. But there is one thing that the librarian can never do. They can never step outside to see the building that houses the actual library. The librarian knows everything within the walls and nothing of what lies beyond them. The librarian's knowledge is complete within its sphere and absolutely limited by that sphere's boundaries. And this parable captures something essential about Kant's critical philosophy and about why Heidegger found in Kant one of the most profound and most tragic figures in the Western tradition. For Kant, human knowledge is absolutely finite. It is bounded by the conditions of possible experience. We cannot know things as they are in themselves. Like, we can never know true reality, independent of the forms of our own sensibility and the categories of our own understanding. We can only know appearances. Erscheinungen, that's another German crazy word, okay? And that's structured by the a priori forms of space and organized by the categories of quantity, quality, relation, and modality. The Ding in sich, the thing in itself. This remains forever inaccessible to theoretical knowledge. So again, when we look at the librarian, it's inside of our mind. The books, everything inside of there, all the knowledge that we can take in from others, the world, these kind of things. But we can never actually know what the library looks like on the outside. We can imagine it, but we'll never know. We can never actually truly see what the library looks like on the outside. We only know what it is on the inside. Heidegger's reading of Kant, presented in his 1929 book, Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics. It's in German again, it's like Handbook. Okay, so it's radically different from the neo-Kantian interpretations that dominated German philosophy in the early 20th century, where figures like Ernest Cassirer saw Kant as primarily an epistemologist, a theorist of scientific knowledge. Heidegger saw Kant as a metaphysician, a thinker attempting to lay the foundation for metaphysics by investigating the essence of human finitude. As Heidegger once argued, the central question of the Critique of Pure Reason is not how is natural science possible, but how is metaphysics possible? Or more precisely, how is the laying of the foundation of metaphysics possible? Synthetic judgments a priori are possible, Heidegger maintained, because human knowledge is finite, and this investigation of finitude constitutes the true center of Kant's critical project. Heidegger means by finitude three things. First, human knowledge is receptive, unlike divine knowledge, which creates its objects by thinking them. Human knowledge must receive its objects from elsewhere. We are affected by what is. Second, human knowledge requires both intuition and concept, a duality expressing the essential structure of finite knowing. We do not create what we know, nor do we merely think abstractly. We must be given something in intuition and then bring it under concepts. Third, and most importantly, human knowledge is finite because it is temporal. Time is the more fundamental form of intuition, the horizon within which any being can show up for us at all. As Heidegger read Kant, Kant had glimpsed that time is not merely one form among others, but the ground of the possibility of any encounter with beings. The most explosive claim in Heidegger's Kant book concerns the first edition of the Critique, specifically the A edition, the Transcendental Deduction. There, Kant presented a triad of subjective sources of knowledge: sense, imagination, and apperception. And Heidegger argued that in these pages, Kant had glimpsed something so radical that it threatened to overturn the entire metaphysical edifice that he was trying to secure. Kant had seen that the transcendental imagination, the faculty mediating between sensibility and understanding, is not merely a bridge between two separate faculties, but is time itself. The imagination is the formative center, the common root from which both sensibility and understanding grow. As Heidegger interpreted it, Kant had touched upon the abyssal ground of subjectivity, the temporal horizon that makes all objectivity possible. But wait, it is not simply time itself in a loose sense. Kant describes it as the faculty that produces schemata, temporal patterns that mediate between pure concepts and sensory intuitions. A schema is not a picture. It is a rule for constructing temporal unities. The schema of substance, for example, is permanence in time. The schema of causality is succession, according to a rule. Heidegger's radical claim is that because all categories must be schematized temporally to apply to experience, the transcendental imagination, the faculty that performs a schematization, is the common root of sensibility and understanding. Time is not a container. It is the productive activity of the imagination giving structure to experience. The reason Kant recoils on Heidegger's reading is that making the imagination foundational means reason itself rests on something non-rational, a blind, productive power that is not governed by logic. That threatens the autonomy of reason, the central commitment of the Enlightenment. The B addition revision, subordinating imagination to understanding, this restores reason's sovereignty at the cost of covering over the temporal ground Kant had uncovered. This precision matters because it sets up Schelling. Schelling will later name that non-rational productive ground explicitly, and unlike Kant, he will not subordinate it to reason, but treat it as reason's equal in origin. But then came the second edition. In 1787, Kant published the B edition of the Critique, and something decisive changed. The transcendental imagination, which in the A edition had stood as independent faculty, co-equal with sensibility and understanding, was now subordinated to the understanding. The imagination was demoted, reinterpreted as a mere function of the understanding's application to sensibility. The triad became a duality, and the common root was buried. Heidegger diagnosed this move not as a simple clarification, but as a retreat, a philosophical recoiling from the abyss that Kant had glimpsed in his first intuition. The B edition in Heidegger's reading was a corrective born of fear. If time is truly the ground of all knowledge, if the transcendental imagination is the temporal core of subjectivity itself, then the project of securing an a priori knowledge of supersensible objects collapses. The metaphysical comfort of eternal truths, of God and the soul and the cosmos as objects of rational faith, becomes completely unstable. Heidegger believed Kant retreated because the ground he had reached was too abysmal and too unsettling. Now, one has to push back on Heidegger's reading here, and many have. Kant himself claimed in the preface to the B edition that the changes were intended to remedy obscurities and misunderstandings, not to alter the doctrine. Whether one believes Kant's self-assessment is a separate question, but it complicates the simple story of retreat. Yet what is undeniable is interpretive drama Heidegger staged. By claiming that the 8th edition, contained Kant's authentic first intuition and that the B edition was a retreat from it, Heidegger performed a radical reversal of the standard scholarly view, which typically treats the B edition as the mature, corrected version. Heidegger, in effect, suggested that Kant in those first edition pages had touched upon the very ground of existence that Schelling, the thinker we will examine next, would later make his own theme. It is as if Kant had already glimpsed the abyss that Schelling would name, only to retreat from it in the second edition. The torch in Heidegger's reading was passed not from Kant to his immediate successors, but from the Kant of 1781 to the Schelling of 1809, with the intervening decades marking a long forgetting. It is a reading that I believe should be called the greatest misprision in the canon of philosophy, a fracture so profound that it opened the fault lines leading all the way to postmodernism. This claim is not universally accepted, of course. Many Kant scholars reject it outright. But historical impact of Heidegger's misreading is indisputable, regardless of my claim's accuracy. Whether one accepts it or rejects it, it is impossible to ignore the seismic force of Heidegger's claim that the true Kant was the Kant of 1781, not 1787, and that the history of philosophy turned on this moment of retreat. What did Heidegger collect from Kant? Well, he collected the insight that human finitude is not a limitation to be overcome, but the very condition of meaning. He collected time as the fundamental structure of existence, the horizon within which being becomes intelligible. He collected the pattern of the retreat, that structural rhythm by which the tradition repeatedly encounters the temporal ground of knowledge and then flees from it, unable to sustain the anxiety of finitude. And he collected the model of fundamental ontology, the project of laying the foundation for metaphysics, not by constructing a system of supersensible objects, but by investigating the finite being who asks the question of being. And don't forget, like, all of that information that he got from Husserl, like most of Husserl's entire project was a corrective of Kant as well. So Heidegger incorporated all of this into being in time. The concept of Dasein is thrown, projecting, and fallen corresponds directly to the threefold structure of care, and these in turn correspond to the three temporal ecstasies: having been, making present, and coming toward. The very project of being in time as a laying of the foundation is explicitly modeled on Kant's critical enterprise, but with the difference that Heidegger refused to retreat. Where Kant pulled back from the temporal imagination, it is said that Heidegger plunged into it. But here's where the story takes its almost human turn. Heidegger, in later years, came to recognize that his 1929 reading of Kant was not merely an interpretation, but an over-interpretation, what he called a Überdeutung. Again, German is not my mother tongue. All right. So in Heidegger's preface to the second edition of the Kant book, published in 1950, Heidegger addressed the charge of violence that critics like Ernest Cassirer had leveled against him. As Heidegger himself wrote, the instances in which he had gone astray and the shortcomings of the endeavor had become so clear to him in the intervening years that he refused to make the work into a patchwork by adding supplements and postscripts. Thinkers, he said, learn from their shortcomings to be more persevering. He let the book stand unrevised, preserving it as it was, with all its excesses and insights intact. Then, in 1973, the preface to the fourth edition, Heidegger went further. He admitted that he had attempted to retract the overinterpretation in later writings, but without writing a new version of the Kant book itself. He revealed that the Kant book had been a refuge underway, a place of shelter as he sought in Kant an advocate for the question of being that he himself had posed. But as Heidegger confessed, in truth, Kant's question is foreign to the manner of questioning set forth in Being in Time. Kant's text became a refuge, but it was a refuge that led Heidegger to interpret the critique from within the horizon of his own questions that were not Kant's own questions. And yet, rather than correcting the book, Heidegger let it stand as an event in time, a document, a particular moment in his path of thinking, with all its erranicies and discoveries preserved like strata in rock. The takeaway then from Kant is this: human knowledge is finite and temporal in its essence, and the Western tradition has repeatedly glimpsed this temporality without sustaining it. The A edition was the moment of vision, the B edition was the moment of retreat. And Heidegger, by refusing to follow Kant in that retreat, by making finitude and temporality the ground rather than the limit of ontology, Heidegger transformed the entire trajectory of modern thought. And in that library, from our parable that began this section, that library, we must learn to see its walls not as a prison, but as the condition of ever having a world at all. And the distinction is, for Kant, the walls are the a priori conditions of possible experience. These walls are fixed, we'll never see the outside of them. For Heidegger, the walls are historical, they shift. So inside these walls is the clearing in which beings appear. And this is not a static structure, but an event that has a history. This is the move from Kant's transcendental philosophy to Heidegger's historical ontology. And it's one of the major ways that Heidegger makes his swerve from Kant. And this kind of brings me to this thinking of maybe I should just have AI read all of my work. I've written so many essays already, and I'm worried that I'll never get them out. I have written extensively on Kant. Kant for me is the greatest philosopher of all time. Absolutely. I mean, reading him, it's hard. First of all, it's such a challenge. Kant is such a challenge to get inside of and to understand. I mean, I watched hours of lectures, walkthroughs of his books. I've listened to one superb thinker, definitely a Kantian. Well, he's Aristotelian, but is Daniel N. Robinson. If you listen to Daniel N. Robinson's lectures on Kant, I mean, be prepared. It's not even easy to understand lectures about him. So, but when you talk about the superiority of Kant's thinking, yeah, Daniel N. Robinson is amazing. And that's after you get the grasp of Kant. I wrote an essay that really works its way through the development of understanding the concepts and, piecing it all together. And like I said, I've written extensively on Kant, and I'm very much looking forward to sharing that with all of you. But for now, this leads us to a thinker whose investigation of freedom, ground, and evil, proved decisive for everything Heidegger wrote after being in time. If Kant opened the abyss of temporal finitude only to close it again, it was Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling who first dared to look into that abyss and name it for what it is. Not an external terror, not a privative darkness, but the positive, self-willing ground that underlies all existence. So the transitional logic is this. Kant discovered that reason has a temporal, non-rational ground. That's the transcendental imagination. And then covered it over to preserve reason's purity. German idealism after Kant, which was Fichte, and then Schelling, then Hegel, took up the problem, Kant bequeathed. Each asked, if reason has a ground it cannot fully rationalize, what is the status of that ground? Firstly, it was Fichte who tried to derive it from the self-positing activity of the I. And Schelling broke with Fichte by insisting that the ground cannot be reduced to the subject. It is anterior to the distinction between subject and object, nature and spirit, even being and not being. The 1809 Freedom Essay is Schelling's most concentrated attempt to think this ground, and it is why Heidegger, in the 1936 lectures, why he treats Schelling as the thinker who pushed furthest into the question of the ground of being, before that question was forgotten again. We must recognize this from why Schelling and not Fichte or someone else is the necessary figure. Without this connective logic, Kant and Schelling, they really do sit in separate rooms. In his 1809 treatise, The Philosophical Investigations into the Essence of Human Freedom, Schelling performed something that no post-Kantian had yet attempted. He pushed systematic philosophy to its logical limit and discovered that at the ground of all rational explanation, there lies something deeply irrational, not a deficiency of reason, but its enabling condition. As Schelling wrote in that dense and explosive text, there is in God a ground of his existence, something which, though indeed identical with his existence in the final synthesis, is nevertheless distinct from it in the moment of generation. This ground is not nothing. It is the mere absence of light or reason. It is a dark, excitable, self-seeking, like will, the subterranean fire from which all existence springs. Schelling called it the Grund, and he insisted that without this ground, there would be no freedom, because there would be no real opposition from which freedom could differentiate itself. We have to be careful to clarify that Schelling is not a vitalist celebrating irrational forces. He is making a precise systematic argument. Reason, to be real, must have something to work upon. If everything were already rational, reason would be redundant, a transparent system with no resistance, no becoming, no history. The ground is not the enemy of reason. It is reason's necessary other, the opacity that reason clarifies without ever eliminating. This is why Schelling locates the ground in God, not as a flaw in divinity, but as the condition for creation, to be a genuine act of freedom rather than a logical deduction. The ground is the eternally dark principle in God that makes actual existence possible, distinct from God as existing light. Heidegger is drawn to this because it mirrors his own distinction between being, like the overall being, and beings like us. Being, the overall, is not a being like us. It is the clearing that lets beings appear. And that clearing has its own withdrawal, its own refusal to show up as an object, a structural darkness at the heart of disclosure. Schelling gave Heidegger language for this: ground, abyss, the ungrounded. Heidegger recognized in this the most radical step in the history of German idealism. In his 1936 lecture course on Schelling's treatise, Heidegger argued that Schelling had touched upon the very question that the entire Western tradition had evaded: the question of the ground of being itself, the Abgrund, or abyssal ground that makes all disclosure possible, while remaining itself concealed. Where Kant had retreated from the transcendental imagination because it threatened to, what Heidegger thinks, threatened to dissolve the metaphysical edifice, Schelling plunged into the ground because he saw that the edifice could not stand without it. The rational system requires an irrational foundation. Light requires a ground that is not itself light. Existence requires a ground that is not yet existence. A dark will, a willingness that makes all willing possible. This is not mysticism in the sloppy sense. Schelling does not abandon logic. He follows it to its ground. He shows that the principle of sufficient reason, pushed to its limit, must account for reason itself. And in doing so, it encounters something that is not a reason, something positive, vital, and free. The ground is the ungrounded, the ungrund, not because it is nothing, but because it is the condition of all grounding. And Heidegger would spend his later career circling this same abyss, from the contributions to philosophy to the fourfold, attempting to think the ground of being is an event that both reveals and withdraws. Where Kant saw the limits of reason and drew back, per Heidegger, Schelling saw the birthplace of freedom and pressed forward. And it is to that press and to Heidegger's own confrontation with the abyss of ground that we now turn. Chapter 7, Schelling. The ground of freedom in the darkness of being. Where Kant retreated from the abyss of the transcendental imagination, Schelling plunged into the ground of existence itself. And it is to that plunge and to Heidegger's confrontation with it. There's a story about a medieval alchemist who spent 30 years trying to transmute lead into gold. He heated and cooled, distilled and combined, recited incantations, performed elaborate rituals. And then one night, exhausted and near despair, he stopped trying. He sat before his furnace in darkness, no longer willing, no longer striving. And in that moment of radical receptivity, the lead showed itself, not as gold, which was merely what he wanted from it, but as something far stranger, as the concentrated darkness of the earth itself, as the silent ground from which all differentiation, all form, all something rather than nothing first emerges. He had glimpsed the ground of all transmutation, the abyss from which all things arise. I do like to use these parables because I believe that, parables always capture something essential about the story. And that one definitely, essential about Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling's 1809 treatise, The Philosophical Investigations into the Essence of Human Freedom, a work that Heidegger described as one of the most profound works of German, thus of Western philosophy, and engaged with in a major lecture course in 1936, returning to it in seminars from 1941 to 43. What Heidegger found in Schelling was not another system to analyze, but a confrontation with dimensions the Western tradition had systematically avoided. The darkness of the ground, the reality of evil as something positive and not merely private, the becoming even of God himself and the radical finitude belonging to being itself. Schelling's question is deceptively simple. What is the nature of human freedom? But as Heidegger demonstrates, Schelling is not asking about free will versus determinism. For Schelling, freedom is not a property of human beings. Human beings are themselves a property of freedom. As Schelling writes in his opening pages of the treatise, freedom is the encompassing nature in which man becomes man only when anchored there. Freedom is a determination of true being itself, transcending merely human being and reaching into the very structure of reality. This reversal from freedom as human attribute to human as manifestation of freedom, this is Schelling's first revolutionary move. It leads into territory that idealism had never explored. If freedom belongs to being as such, the question becomes inseparable from the question of the system. How is a system of freedom possible? How can freedom, that which by its very nature escapes systematic determination, be the ground of a system rather than its exception? This leads Schelling into the deepest problem of ontotheology. For the rationalist idealist tradition, from Spinoza through Leibniz to Kant, the system is one of necessity. Everything follows from God or substance by necessary laws. But if everything is necessary, where does freedom enter? And if freedom is merely an exception to necessity, is it not reduced to the irrational, the arbitrary, the ungrounded? Schelling's answer is breathtaking. Within God himself, he distinguishes ground from existence. The ground is dark, unconscious, seething, the basis from which the light of understanding arises. As Schelling writes in his treatise, in the final and highest judgment, there is no other being than will. Will is primal being, to which alone all predicates of being apply. Groundlessness, eternality, independence from time, self-affirmation. This ground is not a rational foundation, but the ground that withdraws, the abyss, every ground purposes. It is sein such, longing, the yearning of dark principle for unity with light. God, for Schelling, is not complete. God becomes a becoming involving diremption between ground and existence. In the 1809 treatise, Schelling introduces a becoming within God himself, a process that would find its full temporal elaboration only in his later ages of the world. As Heidegger emphasizes, this was unprecedented in the rationalist tradition. Temporality enters the divine itself, and this leads to the question no rationalist dared face with full seriousness. Evil for Schelling, has positive reality. It derives from self-assertion, from the will that separates itself from the universal will and makes itself the center. In human beings, ground and existence are separable, and in this separability is the condition of both freedom and evil, where the center shifts to the periphery, where the dark ground asserts itself against the light of love. There evil arises. It is not a mere absence of good, not a privation, but a real positive force, the higher potency of the ground active in nature, striving toward actuality in created beings. All right, let me pause here and unpack what Schelling actually means by evil having positive reality. And this is going to go a little bit deep. We're going to start getting into the will here. We're going to start treading this ground. Because the claim that evil having a positive reality is counterintuitive and very easy to misunderstand. Then I'll show you how God, ground, and freedom fit together in his 1809 treatise, and why Milton's Satan becomes an indispensable literary figure for this argument. For the tradition running from Augustine through Aquinas, evil is a privation, a lack, a hole where good should be. Evil has no substance of its own. It is simply the absence of corruption, of a good that belongs to a thing by nature. Blindness is not a thing. It is the absence of sight in a being that ought to see. This privative account protects God from being the author of evil, because what God creates is always good. Evil enters only as a falling away, a defect, a nothing. Schelling rejects this. Privative accounts, he argues, cannot make sense of the experience of evil as a force with direction, intensity, and will. A mere absence cannot rebel. A whole cannot actively destroy. So Schelling proposes that evil is real, positive, and rooted in the very structure of existence itself. But this raises an immediate problem. If evil is positive and real, does it come from God? And if it comes from God, how is God not the author of evil? Schelling's answer requires the distinction that organizes his entire treatise, this distinction between ground and existence. God, for Schelling, is not a static unity, but a living becoming. Within God, there is a ground of his existence. Not God as he actually exists in light and love, but that in God which makes existence possible. The dark, excitable, self-seeking will, the craving to exist that is not yet illumined by reason. This ground is not evil. It is the condition for any reality whatsoever. The restless potency without which nothing could emerge from mere possibility into actual being. Schelling calls it a yearning, a blind longing, the will of the depths. But God as he truly is, God as existing, is the light that orders this ground, the love that binds it, the universal will that harmonizes the dark craving into a whole, like a completion. The same dual structure appears in every created being, and most decisively in human beings. Each of us has a ground, the self-will, the particularity that wants to assert itself, the center that insists on its own existence. And each of us has an existence, the capacity to let that self-will be governed by something higher, by the universal will, by love. In God, ground and existence are inseparably bound in an eternal act. The dark ground is always already ordered by light. In human beings, these two principles are separable. That separability is the condition of freedom, because freedom requires the real possibility of choosing one ordering or the other. Evil arises when the separable ground in a human being refuses its proper place. Schelling describes this as an inversion of the relation between the particular will and the universal will, the self-will, which is meant to serve the whole, declares itself the whole. It elevates its own craving to the status of a governing principle. It makes itself the sun around which everything else must orbit. This is not a lack of good. It is a positive, active perversion. The ground, which in itself is merely blind and self-seeking, becomes evil precisely when it absorbs the light of spirit and turns that light into an instrument of its own self-assertion. A blind will alone is not evil. It is simply nature. But a will that has the capacity for reason and love, and then uses that capacity to make its own blind craving the absolute, that is what evil is. It is spirit turned against spirit, light weaponized in the service of darkness. This is why Schelling's evil is idolatrous. The particular will makes itself into the universal. It takes the love that should bind it to the whole and bends it back upon itself. It says, in effect, not the whole, but I, not love, but my desire, not God's order, but my will be done. The self becomes a closed center, a gravitational singularity that pulls everything toward it and refuses relation. That is what Schelling means by the center shifting to the periphery, the ground which belongs at the base of the self as a condition of vitality moves to the top and claims the throne. Now we can see why Milton's Satan is not merely a literary illustration for Schelling, but a philosophical necessity. In Paradise Lost, when Satan declares, "Evil, be thou my good," he is not describing a deficiency. He is performing an act. He is taking the good of his own self-assertion and raising it to the status of a principle. He knows the light and rejects it as his governing law, choosing instead to make his own will the measure. That is positive evil, not privation. Satan is not missing something. He is doing something. He is doing it with the full apparatus of angelic intellect and will. Schelling reads Milton's Satan as the archetypal case of the ground usurping the place of existence, the particular will refusing subordination to the universal, the spirit turning its own power against the order of love. God in this picture is not threatened by evil. The possibility of evil is built into the structure of creation because creation requires a ground that is separable from light. And separable means revolt is really possible. But God's own being is the eternal balance in which the ground is fully penetrated by love without being destroyed. The dark principle is not eliminated. It is ordered. It gives God weight, actuality, life, what Schelling calls personality. Without the ground, God would be an empty abstraction, a pure logical form. With the ground ordered by love, God is a living, personal God capable of real relation. And creation is the process by which the ground is finite beings, is gradually illumined and harmonized. A process that can go wrong precisely where freedom is real. Heidegger's reading of Schelling latches on to this with great intensity. Schelling has placed the possibility of evil at the ontological level, not merely the moral one. The ground is not a regrettable flaw. It is the condition of any reality at all, and therefore the condition of freedom, and therefore the condition of both good and evil. The tradition's privative account of evil was an attempt to protect reason from the irrational. Schelling's positive account forces reason to confront its own dependency on something it cannot fully master. And when the system tries to master it, as Hegel will attempt, as we're about to see, the question becomes whether the ground can really be sublated, aufgehoben. That's Hegel's historical or conceptual process, where something is simultaneously destroyed, preserved, and elevated to a higher ground. So can this be done without being lost? That is the question Schelling leaves behind, and it is the question that drives Heidegger into his later thought. Joan Stemba, in her preface to the English translation of Heidegger's lecture course, observed that Schelling is the first in the rationalist idealist tradition to grapple seriously with evil as a metaphysical problem rather than a moral or theological inconvenience. Heidegger reads Schelling not as a transitional figure between Fichte and Hegel, but as a thinker who pressed the question of being further than his contemporaries, and who broke down precisely because the ground he reached could not be sustained within idealism's vocabulary. Heidegger would later draw a parallel between Schelling's breakdown and Nietzsche's, suggesting that both thinkers collapsed under the weight of a question the tradition could not sustain, and that this collapse was itself the sign of something new attempting to emerge. Now, before we turn to Hegel, we need to follow a thread that runs beneath all three of today's thinkers, Kant, Schelling, and we've been talking about Nietzsche a little bit here, and that Heidegger himself traced with increasing urgency. It's the problem of a groundless primordial aspect of being that the tradition kept trying to name through the concept of will. And if we track how this concept moves from Kant to Schelling to Nietzsche, we'll understand exactly why Heidegger saw the collapse of the latter too, not as a failure to be lamented, but as the sign of something new trying to break through. Kant is where the problem first crystallizes in its modern form. You see, for Kant, freedom is not the ability to follow any impulse that arises. It is precisely the opposite, the capacity to act according to a law that reason gives itself, reason gives to itself, independent of inclination, desire, impulse. Those inclinations that we might call the blind, sensuous will, that is not freedom for Kant. They are determination by something other than reason. So Kantian freedom is actuated by suppressing that will, by subordinating the chaotic push of desire to the rational form of the moral law. The will that matters is the rational will. The blind will is what must be overcome. But Kant's account leaves a question unanswered. Where does that blind will come from, and what is its ontological status? It can't be nothing. It has force. It opposes reason. It is real enough to be a genuine obstacle. And if it is real, then reality itself contains something that reason does not fully govern. Schelling picks up exactly here. This is where the Kleinemann happens, the great swerve. He takes what Kant treated as a moral psychological problem and transforms it into an ontological one. The blind will, the dark craving. This is not simply a feature of finite human sensibility. For Schelling, it is the ground of God's own existence, the uncreated, self-seeking potency without which nothing could emerge into actuality. This ground is not evil in itself, but it is the condition that makes evil possible. Evil occurs when this ground in a human being refuses its proper subordinate place, when the particular will elevates itself to the status of the universal and makes itself the center. That inversion, as we just saw, is not a lack of good, but a positive, active perversion, spirit weaponized in service of blind self-assertion. Schelling had held this darkness, and the light of love are eternally balanced in God. But in finite beings, they are separable. And that separability is the condition of both freedom and evil. So I just wanted, I know I did a huge segment on that already, but I really want to make sure that this is not misunderstood. He doesn't think that God produces evil at all. The darkness, the ground, the bottomless, this will is actually excitable energy. That's what it is. And in God, it's completely harmonious. It's the spirit. It's the energy. It's the energy behind things. And in human beings, it becomes separated. So the thing is that the human being is incapable, or I guess this is the human challenge. This is the test. Like, can you handle your darkness? Can you handle that energy? And can you aim that energy towards the good? And I mean, I think that's what Kant is saying. Like, you have this will, this energy, this force that's pushing you, and you have to make sure that it does good things. It's up to you. That's your decision, but you have to make sure that it does good things and it doesn't turn into desire and, all of these selfish and immoral practices. Of course, Kant gives us moral grounding, so I guess we could call it that, really. Now, Heidegger's claim is that this discovery that reality has an irrational, unmasterable ground, it placed a pressure on Schelling's system that it could not bear. The dark ground was to be held inside a rational framework. Schelling's published philosophy stalls after 1809. He keeps trying to rewrite the system, and he cannot. The conceptual container basically shatters. Nietzsche, decades later, takes up the same element, now called the will to power, and pushes it even further. Where Schelling tried to balance the ground with light, Nietzsche drops the balance entirely. The will is everything. It commands, overcomes, creates, and destroys values. But Nietzsche, too, breaks. His final years are silence and disintegration, and his notes remain a fractured, unorganized mass. Heidegger sees in this the same structural collapse that both thinkers tried to ground reality in the will, and both were broken by it, not because they were weak thinkers, but because the concept of will itself is still a concept of metaphysics. It treats being as a force, a substance, a drive, something present, something we can name and master. And that is exactly what being is not. So when Heidegger draws the parallel between Schelling's breakdown and Nietzsche's, he is not pointing at personal tragedy. He's pointing at a historical limit. The old metaphysical vocabulary, including the vocabulary of the will, simply could not hold the question of a ground that is not a being, not a force, not a thing. The collapse was the sign that something else was attempting to emerge, a way of thinking being, not as a ground or will, but as an event, as clearing, as the giving of a historical world that can never be objectified. That is the thread we will carry forward. But first we have to reckon with the thinker who tried to absorb all of this, the ground, the negative, the irrational, into the self-movement of the concept. And that is Hegel, which we will get to soon. But first, let's ask. So what did Heidegger collect from Schelling? He collected the Grundexistenz, distinction, the insight that being is not a flat, homogeneous presence, but it is structured by a difference, a difference between the ground and what emerges from it, a model that would inform Heidegger's own ontological difference between being and beings. He collected the Unvordenklicht, I don't know, I'm not German, And that's the unprethinkable, the groundless ground that precedes all rational grounding, which points towards Heidegger's own Abgrund, the abyssal ground that makes all disclosure possible while remaining itself concealed. He collected the recognition that evil is not a moral failure, but a metaphysical possibility rooted in the very structure of freedom, a positive reality that arises when self-will separates from the universal will. He collected the insight that the systematic idealism of the tradition, pushed to its limit, encounters a ground it cannot think, and that this encounter is not a failure of philosophy, but its most authentic moment. And one might hear in Schelling's Dark Ground a prefiguration of Heidegger's own later concept of earth, that which rises up in the work of art as the self-secluding foundation of all world. The takeaway from Schelling, then, is this. Being has a dark ground with withdraws from all conceptualization, and freedom is rooted in this ground. Evil arises when the self of the ground separates from the universal will of love. The tradition's inability to think this ground is inseparable from the forgetting of being, and the thinker who dares to look into the abyss risks breaking down because the vocabulary of metaphysics is not built to sustain what the abyss reveals. But if Schelling plunged into the ground and insisted that reason must acknowledge an irreducible darkness as its foundation, there was another thinker in the idealist tradition who took up the same problem and answered it with the most ambitious system philosophy had ever seen. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel did not deny the ground that Schelling had named. He denied that it remained outside of reason's reach. Where Schelling left the system fractured by a darkness that thought could encircle but never fully illuminate, Hegel set out to demonstrate that the darkness is not an external limit to reason, but reason's own internal motor, that the abyss is not outside the concept, but is the concept's own self-movement towards absolute knowing. If Schelling is the thinker of the ground that withdraws, Hegel is the thinker of the system that claims to have retrieved it. To understand what Hegel attempted, we have to grasp the basic operation of his dialectic. For Hegel, any finite determination, any claim, any being, any category proves to be one-sided when thought pushes it to its limit. It generates its own negation, and that negation is not simply a failure. It is productive. The collision of a positive and its negation does not leave thought empty. It drives thought to a higher unity that preserves both moments while transforming their meaning. As I mentioned before, Hegel called this process sublation, Aufhebung, a word that, again, remember, it means once to cancel, to preserve, and then to lift up. The ground that Schelling treated as a stubborn, opaque remainder is, on Hegel's account, precisely the negativity that drives the dialectic forward. It looks like an obstacle only if one stops at a particular stage of the process and refuses to see that the whole is not a collection of static parts, but a living movement of self-knowing. This is why Hegel could claim that the true is the whole. The ground is not something separate from the system that reason builds. It is the first, most abstract moment of the system, the bare immediacy of being that turns out, on inspection, to be indistinguishable from nothing, and which then generates the category of becoming. The entire science of logic unfolds from this initial insight that being in its utter indeterminacy is identical to nothing, and that this identity is not a dead emptiness, but a restlessness that produces determinacy, the dark ground, the ungrund, the abyss that Schelling placed before all determination. Hegel locates it within this logical movement itself, and the negative moment that every positive category requires. It is not irrational. It is the rational in its most elementary form. This has direct consequences for how Hegel understands time and history. If Schelling's ground is always already there as the eternal past of God, a past that was never a present, Hegel's dialectic is temporal, through and through, but in a specific sense. Time is the form in which spirit externalizes itself in order to return to itself as self-consciousness. History is not a random sequence of events. It is the labor of the concept, the process by which spirit works through its own self-estrangement and comes to know itself as the truth of the whole. The restless negativity that Schelling found in the ground becomes, in Hegel's hands, the engine of historical development. Every epoch, every form of consciousness is a partial grasp of the truth that negates itself and gives way to a more adequate form. The darkness is not a final mystery. It is the alienation that spirit suffers on its way to this full self-recognition. And what of time itself? For Hegel, time is the existing concept, the concept in its external sensuous form. In the phenomenology of spirit, time appears as the destiny and necessity of spirit that has not come yet completed itself. Spirit must become time in order to overcome time. Absolute knowing, the final stage of the phenomenology, is the point at which spirit grasps its own movement as a whole and thereby sublates temporality into the eternal present of self-thinking thought. The negation, the otherness, the dispersal of moments in time, all of this is that sublation, that aufgehoben in the system. The result is that time is not an irreducible horizon, the forever conditions thought. Time is a moment in the life of the absolute, a moment that is necessary, but ultimately overcome. Heidegger's critique of Hegel turns precisely on this claim. For Heidegger, Hegel represents the most powerful and complete version of what he called the metaphysics of presence. Despite the dynamism of the dialectic, despite the centrality of negativity and becoming, the telos of the Hegelian system is parousia, the full presence of absolute spirit to itself. Parouisa, so like ouisa, the substance of Aristotle. This is parouisa, the full presence of absolute spirit to itself, where all otherness is reconciled and all temporal dispersal is gathered into the eternal now. The dialectic moves, but it moves in order to rest. Time serves the concept, and the concept's ultimate form is pure self-transparency, a presence that owes nothing to absence, nothing to the withholding that Heidegger sees as constitutive of being itself. Heidegger's specific engagement with Hegel on this point appears in a dense but crucial section of Being and Time, where he argues that Hegel's concept of time is derived from the ordinary, leveled down understanding of time as a sequence of now points. Hegel radicalizes this ordinary conception, giving it speculative depth, but he never breaks free of its fundamental structure. For Hegel, time is the negation of negation, the process by which the now negates itself into the past and projects itself into the future. But the truth of this process is the eternal present of spirit. Heidegger's countermove is to insist that primordial temporality is not a sequence of nows at all. It is the ecstatic unity of future, having been, and present that we explored in the introduction. A structure that is not heading toward a final synthesis in which all moments are gathered, but is instead finite, open, and always stretched between birth and death. The ecstasis does not become a higher unity. They remain distinct. This is personal. And their distinction is the condition for any experience of time at all. To absorb them into the concept, as Hegel does, is to lose the very structure that makes temporal existence what it is. This is why Hegel stands as the culmination of the metaphysical tradition, and for Heidegger, its most formidable adversary. He is the thinker who took the problem Schelling had uncovered, the problem of the ground, and attempted to solve it by expanding reason's scope until nothing remained outside of it. Where Kant retreated from the temporal ground of knowledge, and Schelling named that ground but left it as an irreducible fissure, Hegel integrated that fissure into the self-movement of spirit and claimed to have shown it to be rational after all. The cost on Heidegger's reading is immense. Finitude is absorbed into infinity, temporality into eternity, and the question of being is answered by a system that leaves no remainder. But for Heidegger, the remainder is the whole point. Being is not a problem to be solved by reason's self-completion. It is the event of unconcealment that grants every historical world its sense of what it is, while itself never appearing as a being within that world. To think being, one must think finitude without sublating it, time without overcoming it, and the ground without illuminating it entirely. Hegel's achievement, then, is the most rigorous attempt in the Western tradition to bring the entire movement of reality into the light of the concept. Whether he succeeded, or whether, as Heidegger argued, his success was purchased by forgetting the very condition that makes any light possible, and that is the question that will echo through everything that follows. And it is to that question and to Heidegger's own attempt to think being beyond the grasp of the system. This is where we must now turn.